So this is my second request. Good for me. And what a request. Now, when I was 16, I had this terrible car. 3 of the windows didn't work, you had to crawl in through the back seat. When you turned on the radio, the radio didn't play, but you could hear the engine through the speakers. I don't know what was up with that. Awful, awful vehicle. However, I have some very introspective memories of that car because it's where I watched every single episode of Serial Experiments Lain. I had intended to only watch one episode and then go inside, but I was so engrossed I just sat there and watched it all. The issue there is that, on reflection, I couldn't exactly tell you what the show is about. So over the years, I've watched the show again and again and again until today, when I think I have a moderate understanding of the show. Now don't get me wrong, I think I got the major themes down, but much of the execution and style choices evade me even today. And I guess I'm not the only one, because Lain comes up at my panels every single time without fail, excepting last year's Akon for some reason. Now I'm actually convinced that this show doesn't leave a strong impression because it's super thoughtful. I think this show leaves a strong impression because it's strange, and thereby tricks you into thinking it's more thoughtful than it actually is. Don't get me wrong, the show asks some great questions and really does deserve analysis, but, well, as an example, Spice and Wolf is probably the most thought-invoking anime I've ever seen, and I've only ever gotten one request about that one at cons. Now's time for a very important aside. I'm not going to be discussing the aesthetics of Lain at all, and here's why. If I was to get into what every single image and every single moment, every single strange happenstance that happened throughout the series, I would be here all day. Anyway, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. As with most stories, Lain asks a broad question, a specific question, and answers that specific question. On the broad, Lain covers 3 subjects: the effects the internet has had on the world, how communications has changed in, say, the past 20 years, and what does it mean to communicate? Now comes the hard part for anybody who asks me to analyze this anime. See, I'm almost positive that those broad themes are what people want to know about when they ask about Lain. And know what? I'd love to talk about them. What's the issue then? Well, each of those questions is a college-level course, and one of them is a confounded major. In other words, I don't have the time, and in fact, I would probably need about 4 years to cover all the ground there. But don't fret, I got you covered with some recommended reading that I'll mention at the end of the video. Now, what's the only slightly less interesting specific question that Lain asks? I'll abridge it like this. What if God had an existential crisis? Existentialism is a branch of philosophy that deals with questions about one's self-worth, your purpose, perhaps even whether or not they really exist. Fans of Evangelion may also recognize this as Shinji vomit. You know, I'd normally put a spoiler warning here, but honestly, I think a better understanding of the plot and the themes of Lain might actually improve a new viewer's experience to a series that can be very, very alienating. To very, very quickly summarize the plot of the show, we have Lain, who is slowly realizing that she is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Or in layman's terms, God. So how do I come to my whole God is in an existential crisis conclusion? Well, it's entirely through observation of Lain. You know, one of my favorite things to do when someone tells me that they like Serial Experiments Lain is I like to ask them for their favorite quote. Though sometimes they surprise me, the most common response I get is, smiley face. So I'm going to start from there in my dissection of the series. So, keeping in mind that Lain is becoming God, what does this quote mean? Well, let's break it down a little. God is asking what it feels like to die. Why? Well, Lain was asking out of curiosity, but what does it mean for God to be asking that? Well, God, by most definitions, isn't going to die. So the idea of God asking what death is like is somewhat akin to, I don't know, well, a blind person asking what it's like to see, grasping for an understanding of something completely foreign, which is, of course, existential. Now, one way to dive into this just a little bit further is to look up some Lain quotes and imagine the Christian God saying them. This won't work quite as well with the Lain at the beginning of the series who's still trying to figure out how the internet works, but sometimes you get real gold, like with this example. People only have substance within the memories of other people, and that's why there were all kinds of me's. There weren't a lot of me's per se, I was just inside all sorts of people, that's all. I mean, wow. That's pretty heavy. I could probably do an entire episode on just that one quote. Now, I could spend all day going through every single episode, hitting every single existential question that Lain asks, but in the interest of brevity, I'm just going to hit my personal favorite.
If I'm nowhere, then what? Then who am I? And where am I?
So what's the end effect of God's existential crisis? Well, Lain figures out her role and decides to watch after humans. Why? Well, because she logically came to that decision after evaluating her powers. Now, I personally think that speaks pretty highly of Lain, as it's pretty easy to write us humans off as terrible creatures. But then again, on the other hand, due to her self-doubting crisis, she better understands the plight of human existence, the terrors we face within our own mind. So is this good or bad? Well, it kind of depends on the flavor of God you like. Do you like your God to be a tall tower of moral perfection and goodness? Or do you like your God to be relatable, someone you, I don't know, might have coffee with? Now, here's the hardest part of this review of all. A lot of this is just thought material. I can't tell you how to feel about this show. In fact, the creator even said that he left it open to interpretation so that it would bring discussion. Remember I said before that I felt lots of the execution and style choices the show made were strange? Well, this is what I mean. The end result of the show leaves you feeling sort of vague and not knowing how to feel. But if that's the point that the creator wanted to get across, good for him. Okay, this has gone on long enough. Let me recommend a few books. Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Any college-level intro to communication book. And I'm actually going to recommend a book I don't actually recommend you buy unless you want to go to college for communications, as it's expensive and a high-level college text. Theories of Human Communication by Stephen W. Littlejohn. Now, if you want a little more existentialism in your diet, I'm going to suggest just one book, Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. And with that, wow, this is getting pretty high-minded, and my recommended readings are getting more and more complex and unapproachable. I'll work on that. In the meantime, I pose you a thought experiment. Who would win in a fight between Haruhi and Lain? Anyway, I'm open 24 hours and I'll serve knowledge all night.